Here we go.
All right. Let's see here. Let's get this up. And all right.
We just
So,
had it. I know it's there.
yeah, can you see it here?
No, no, not now.
Oh, all right. Hold on. Let's see. Share screen. How's
All
that?
right. We are in business.
All right. All right. So African American heritage sites that I'll talk about today are governed to one degree or another. There are layers of county and state authorities that have oversight and are empowered to determine the fate of such sites, as they do with many of the cultural resources present in Maryland and Virginia suburbs and throughout the DC metropolitan area. Because of the history of episodic displacements of African American communities in Washington and its suburbs, we're talking about traces of those communities that remain and are largely developed over in the middle decades of the 20th century. Cemeteries and churches are the most visible markers of these former places, and these kinds of sites link an extended community to the sites of their former habitations, the fortunes of their families, and their home places. So descendants and communities frequently do not control the places, lands, or resources connected with this heritage. So how is that control attained? Who is seeking it? And what is the basis for control over these heritage sites to be shared or surrendered? And how does archaeology fit in? There we go. 20 years ago, there was not much public interest in African American heritage research and documentation. There were some heritage surveys that were funded that focused on specific resources, but public funding or regulatory interest in African American places was not very common. Prince George's County was one of the government units that was to help change this, really starting with the update to the Historic Sites and Districts Plan in 2004. Prince George's County had been majority Black since the colonial era, but in the early 2000s, the county's elected government became majority Black. They noticed rather quickly that archaeology and historic preservation in the county was focused on the big house. And they did an extraordinary thing. They put their money where their mouth was and funded a series of initiatives designed to shift some of the emphasis to looking at the undocumented history and erased heritage of the Black residents of the county. The first funded initiative was aimed at archaeology and included funding for 2 research guides shown here. The first for antebellum agriculture and the second for postbellum archaeological resources throughout the county. We put together the antebellum guide, which included models for antebellum plantation landscapes throughout the county. The guide was not simply an archaeological model. It was aimed at understanding labor, which meant slave labor, and also labor from the free Black community within the county. Plantation owners, merchants, clergy, and even white laborers were well documented through traditional historical and genealogical methods due to the availability and specificity of many types of historical documents available. But the historical documentation of African Americans was scant, and so archaeology became a primary source of information on the lives of the enslaved. The postbellum guide, which was prepared by Paul Creasa and his team at Stantec Consulting, looked at a number of important issues. For example, how can we use archaeology to better understand the transition of most African Americans from enslaved to free people, and in turn, the transition to free members of a capitalist society? It looked at how we can identify archaeological evidence of Jim Crow, if it is at all definable in terms of material culture, and more broadly, how we can structure investigations at African-American sites to help inform about the past of marginalized people, to provide a critique of American society, and how archaeological investigations at African-American sites can stimulate a broad dialogue with African-American communities regarding the interpretation and presentation of their history. Both of these research guides stimulated a lot of thought about the things we can accomplish with archaeology, as well as the role of archaeology as a means of fostering social justice. And I'll talk more about this later in the presentation. Prince George's efforts also extended to the way we documented above ground resources. The county funded a series of African American heritage surveys to document places throughout the county that were significant to the African American community. Again, this posed challenges to the way these resources were documented and interpreted. Significance to historic properties comes from three criteria: association with an important person, an association with a significant event, or as an architectural example that is either the work of a master or a type of architecture that is a good representation of a particular period or style. This gave rise to a problem that descriptive techniques and the metrics used to prepare architectural inventory forms and evaluate historic buildings failed to adequately convey significance for many types of heritage sites that we were documenting. For example, how would you document a barber shop in a modestly designed mid-20th century strip mall that was in relatively poor condition and with no real character defining features or architectural merit, and with no documented association with a noted architect, a famous person, or a significant event? Well, one way was to conduct oral histories. The memories of living African-American residents has proven to be a highly important component of assessing the significance of places associated historically with African-Americans. Mr. Smith, shown here in the slide, who is nearly 90 years old, still worked at the shop when we interviewed him and his daughter. Through this data collection technique, we were able to document that this unremarkable building with a seemingly ordinary business was not simply a haircutting business. On Sundays after church, the wives went home to cook the Sunday meal, and the men would congregate at the barber shop, which had one of the few televisions in the community. And the men would discuss current events and mobilize for action during the civil rights era. And so, despite being an unremarkable and insignificant architectural resource, the oral histories were able to convey the significance of that property with respect to its role in local activism during the civil rights era. The past 20 years has also seen a great increase in the interpretation of African-American heritage sites. The Written in Bone exhibit in the center of the slide was developed by the Smithsonian Institution, but the set of blue and white beads and oyster shell depicted in the slide was associated with an African woman that was buried with those grave goods sometime between 1640 and 1680, which was part of a compliance project that took place on state land in Virginia during the construction of a building at the Virginia Institute of Marine Science. All of the early burials were associated with individuals that died soon after arrival to the New World. We worked with exhibit design staff, curational staff, and the museum's physical anthropology staff to integrate the collection into the exhibit. And when the exhibit ended in 2013, we assisted with the Smithsonian effort to get a long-term loan from the Commonwealth of Virginia for the materials to be part of the permanent collections at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. On the lower left and right are placeholder photos to remind us that planning and outreach funding for local and state projects is also something that archaeologists do, which deviates from the commonly held view of our role in doing research. We've had the opportunity to work with historians and folklorists on collaborative research that involves communities and revitalization projects. We've worked with natural resource specialists on public events that might be part of community planning. For example, documenting African-American historic districts, or master planning with design teams for preserving or interpreting historic elements to landscape features in recreational space. And we've worked with public historians to develop and commemorate and communicate interpretive plans for outdoor education opportunities that engage very specific groups. For example, school classes, scout troops, historic societies, and other types of community organizations. And all of this is part of modern archaeology's domain, even though it might not look like the type of thing that archaeologists are supposed to do. In the larger perspective, archaeologists are now part of broader collaborations with African American communities. These are not easy. They require trust, and they can be very contentious. Working with descendant communities that involve African American heritage sites can be a highly sensitive and emotionally charged endeavor for a variety of factors, including the marginalization and erasure of Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities, BIPOC communities, historically, and their lack of empowerment in the present. So how do we get from a bunch of broken pottery in the ground to connect with modern day predicament of descendant communities? In 2012 and 13, we worked at Salubria Plantation, which is at National Harbor. It's underneath the outlet malls today. Salubria was an early 19th century plantation, which is reflective of the sensitive and difficult conversations that develop from research that exposes and confronts uncomfortable historic narratives. The public was engaged in the project and included an active preservation group of African American county residents who viewed the site as highly significant in African American history and heritage. The owner of the plantation, Dr. Bain, was a slave owner who experienced the tragic murder of his two sons from poisoning, which ultimately resulted in the conviction and hanging of a 14-year-old slave girl under his ownership. By the end of the Civil War, Dr. Bain recanted his position in support of slavery and became an active promoter of African American freedom, a somewhat unusual and significant event in that time in American history. But in the development of the historic, in the public interpretive plan, the African American community did not want to focus on the tragic event as the focal point of historical interpretation and memorialization. In fact, we see this a lot. African American communities want to talk less about the harshness of slavery and more about the positive messages concerning their descendants. Ultimately, the Potomac River Heritage Visitor Center, located in the Tanger Outlets, incorporated exhibits, artifacts, projection shows, interpretive panels, and literature about a wider range of important historical and cultural places in Prince George's County. The Salubria Memorial Garden and History Walk features large panels that interpret the lives of the slaves that lived at Salubria. The Ottery Group's work on the master plan for Walker Mill Regional Park in Prince George's was largely focused on the restoration and adaptive reuse of the Concord Plantation, which is at the core of the property. It was protected by state and county preservation easements. The manor house was built in 1797 by Zachariah Berry, who was also a prosperous planter and financier that had land holdings throughout the county. Initially, in the planning process, the planners wanted to use the manor house for community meetings and focus the historical interpretation of the park on the contributions of the families that owned the property and contributed to the development of Prince George's County. But given that the county as a whole, and thus park users, is majority African American, the planning process shifted to emphasize the adaptive reuse of the Concord Manor House for office space, and the site interpretive program was refocused to emphasize the broad contributions of the labor force that created modern Prince George's County. A critical part of the African-American experience comes from cemetery projects. Given the erasure of African-American heritage from the historical landscape, cemeteries are often the sole tangible evidence to descendant communities that reflect their historical presence, and thus burial spaces provide a sense of place to modern communities of color. Our work at Fort Ward in Alexandria was an outgrowth of a number of African-American cemetery documentation projects that we did between 2005 and 2010. Fort Ward in Alexandria was one of the Civil War defenses of Washington. As a Union-held area during the Civil War, runaway slaves flocked to the fort. At the end of the war, several families purchased that land, starting a community known as the Fort. The small community contained several houses, a church, and a school. But in the early 1960s, as part of the city of Alexandria's plans to restore Fort Ward for the centennial of the Civil War, the land was seized through eminent domain and their dwellings razed. The Fort Ward descendant community retained a strong sense of place that was based in part on the presence of grave sites that had markers removed to expand a maintenance area within the park. The city of Alexandria desired a collaborative effort with the descendant community to locate the grave sites and determine how the locations should be marked and memorialized. In 2010, as part of the upcoming 50th anniversary of Fort Ward Historical Park, the city of Alexandria came to us with a multi-year project involving archaeological, architectural, and historical research and field study. The primary focus was included the documentation of the family cemeteries that were reported through earlier historic research and the delineation of the parts of the cemetery that were lost when the fence line for the church cemetery was moved and the grave markers tossed into the woods. The descendant community associated with the fort had been active in its advocacy for recognition, specifically for these grave sites that had been lost during the construction and use of the park. So a ground penetrating radar study was conducted to identify anomalies that were interpreted as possible grave site locations. And through a combination of mechanical and hand excavation, we found 23 unmarked graves that were identified and marked for commemoration. So while the project was successful in locating and marking the lost grave sites, the city ultimately failed to accommodate other aspects of recognition desired by the descendant community. So the success of collaboration with historically marginalized communities provides a tool of empowerment that can ultimately be undermined when the sponsoring institution exercises its position of wealth and power to maintain control over the process of collaboration, which is unfortunately what happened. We were ordered to have our embedded scholar that was working with the descendant community to stop communications with this descendant community. And at that time, that scholar, Mary Furlong, was completing her doctorate at University of Maryland on Fort Ward, and she was not under our control. And so the result was our contract was not renewed. This is not unique. Many of you may recall the recent events at James Madison's Montpelier, in which the foundation's board of directors entered into a governance sharing agreement with the descendant community. But the foundation, despite its initial intentions, reneged on that arrangement. And ultimately, the archaeologists which supported the descendant community were all fired. And ironically, Mary Furlong, who had completed her dissertation at that time on the African-American descent community at the fort, was the chief archaeologist at Montpelier. Many of the cemetery projects reveal a complex social and governmental relationship with Africa that archaeology can document. We assisted the Virginia Department of General Services with the historic documentation of a circa 1870 to 1920s unmarked cemetery at the Virginia Central State Hospital campus in Petersburg, Virginia. Documentation included the geophysical survey to delineate the cemetery bounds and document the presence of almost 4,500 unmarked graves in the cemetery. A corresponding record search was used to document the mostly African-American hospital patients that were buried in the cemetery. Geophysical survey has successfully mapped the locations of more than 4,200 burials and provided some evidence for as many as 4,480 grave sites. The results reveal that the arrangement and extent of the graves, showing that they're arranged in mostly regular rows within an area of, this is only 2.6 acres. And the physical documentation that we did determined the boundaries and allowed for the protection of those graves. But here's the interesting part, or possibly the disturbing part. When we reviewed archival records from the Central State Hospital, the documentation included data from the hospital's annual reports, as well as patient records, account books, photographs, and administration records. The number of burials identified during the geophysical survey did not account for the reported deaths as seen at the hospital from the acquisition of land for the hospital in 1884 to the approximate date for the closure of the cemetery in 1924. So the research indicated that approximately 1,500 individuals and as many as 1,700 deceased patients were absent from the hospital cemetery. A portion of these are accounted for in hospital records, which document the transfer to undertakers for burials outside of the cemetery in accordance with family wishes, and paid for with private, not public funds. But the balance of these individuals were likely transferred by Central State Hospital to the State Anatomical Review Board as cadavers for the Medical College in Richmond. The research has contributed to the documentation of the institutional treatment of African Americans that remains at the forefront of this national conversation on historical and persistent racial disparities in American society. The firm's work in documenting the Moses African American Cemetery, which is recently, for the past few years, actually been in the papers pretty often, is located in the westward sector of River Road in Bethesda. And it's another example of the complexity associated with contested aspects of African American heritage. As early as the 1870s, an African American community was present along River Road. The cemetery was established in the early 20th century. But by the 1960s, suburban development in the DC metropolitan area expanded at a very rapid pace. Most of the River Road community was purchased by developers, and the remaining African American residents were ultimately removed by county authorities in an effort to improve sanitation for the growing, largely white suburban communities. One institution that remained on River Road was the Macedonian Baptist Church, an African American organization with a small African American congregation. In the 1970s, developers constructed a parking lot on the cemetery parcel to serve an apartment tower on an adjacent parcel. Historic preservation staff at the planning board recognized the presence of the cemetery. However, other public agencies, including the Housing Opportunities Commission, which owned the properties, refused to take action to resolve the issues associated with the cemetery. So the Macedonian Baptist Church mobilized and staged protests to force action, arguing that the River Road community had been harmed historically and continues to be harmed by the various public and private institutions and the legal precedents concerning property rights that govern regulatory authority from the county over development. In September 2021, the case went to litigation. I had the opportunity to serve as an expert witness. The court's decision recognized the legal standing of the community organization and prevented the HOC sale. However, no additional study or planning for the cemetery was conducted, and instead the HOC went to an appeals court in which they won. So the African American community remains aggrieved over the failure of modern institutions to recognize and mitigate the effects of the historical processes of marginalization and erasure. So although many projects related to African American heritage sites are highly sensitive and present complex and sometimes conflicting responses from the subject communities, the professional historic preservation community has generally been responsive to engagements with BIPOC communities and have been increasingly aware of the needs, sensitivities, and the mistrust that accompanies projects that place technical experts in positions of power to interpret and explain aspects of heritage to these communities rather than with these communities. African Americans established communities in rural areas proximal to Washington, but outside of it, in Washington County or the surrounding counties, Montgomery County, even in Maryland. These communities are somewhat reliant on local economies for access to markets and sources of employment, but more importantly, their family networks and other social connections that are just as vital to maintain for mutual support. Economic independence is also what these settlements offer, and they are a key strategy for wealth accumulation in a climate of legalized discrimination and race hatred that denied most any opportunities or advantages to people of color. These spaces, we've argued, are also situated outside of the jurisdiction of municipalities, where there's a greater degree of freedom in regards to land use. They're spaces that are not governed in the way that urban places are governed, and they feature apparent greater security from displacement because lands available for purchase are not always the most favorable places to live or farm. More so, they are lands that are allowed to African Americans. And this is something I just make a quick reference to Cheryl LaRoche's book called Free Black Communities and the Underground Railroad, The Geography of Resistance, which talks about something that we see all the time in our work. Place names betray African American communities historically. Places like Vinegar Hill in Brightwood, Snake Den in Scotland, Maryland, Herring Hill in Georgetown, and others. These were code words on historic maps that let white travelers know where not to go in these areas. And once these places are developed with suburban communities, those names tend to change to things that are more palatable. Also, sort of as a quick aside, in a more extreme context, the term sundown town applies to places that by policy, violence, or both, Black people were barred from being present after dark. In this region, for the most part, these communities existed in a certain amount of isolation to some extent. These are settlements in the counties surrounding Washington, D.C., and the district in Prince George's and Montgomery counties before there was countywide zoning planning or coherent permitting or coherent planning. These communities are displaced during suburban development, right? The assembly of large parcels of land for commercial and residential real estate development, highway projects that are indifferent to the presence of existing communities, and the establishment of parklands and water control projects in stream valleys for the Potomac River tributaries. African Americans have no recourse and are forced out in this context, either reestablishing displaced communities or scattering and resettling following available support from family networks that may be in the area or in the resettled area. In the present moment of overdevelopment in the Washington-Baltimore region and in Northern Virginia, these places where African American communities have been developed are being redeveloped in a way that creates potential to encounter traces of these former communities and for those traces to become heritage. Really, they may or may not become heritage. They may or may not become sites of struggle, but it really depends on the composition of the particular setting and scenario. So African-American cemeteries bring focus to the critical importance of collaboration with descendant communities. Unlike collaborative research, however, the engagement of descendant communities seeks a practical result, that is, recognition. Cemetery sites are evidence of the episodic, historical, and ongoing displacements of African-American communities in the DC region and its suburbs, and they raise up the heritage of free Black settlements in Montgomery County in places that are now DC's majority white suburbs. This struggle over the Moses Cemetery was one that ended up with as being a study of the struggle, controversy, and litigation surrounding the Moses Cemetery. The regulatory void refers to the inadequacy and the crassness of framing African-American cemeteries as cultural resources, and really the ability of this framework to properly address the extended history of discriminatory practices in land use planning, the inability to see a future for these places beyond regulatory frameworks that tilt in favor of land development. African-American descendants in their localized diasporas frequently do not directly control the places, lands, or sites connected with their heritage. So how is that control attained? What is the basis for control over these heritage sites to be shared or ceded? How do cultural resources management by the county and others fit in? There are layers of county and state authorities that have oversight and are empowered to determine the fate of sites like Moses Cemetery in Bethesda. The mechanism for regulation here is typically a series of requirements for assessments and mitigation attached to land development, following a polluter pays model. That is, if you own land and you want to develop it, you're also responsible to comply with cultural resource laws that are triggered by the development that you're proposing. In this context, archaeologists work closely with regulators, but our literal clients are the developers. Sometimes the developer is the state or county government, but largely they're private developers. So working for developers hand in glove with county regulators is a compromised position from the point of view of Black county residents in many instances. The funding for archaeology is tainted money in this sense. That is precisely because of the historical collusion in the counties, a parallel process to redlining that segregated new suburbs that broke up existing Black suburbs during the middle 20th century. In the present moment of overdevelopment in the Washington-Baltimore area and in Northern Virginia, we're seeing the Washington suburbs literally running out of undeveloped land. In this climate, aging developments from mid-century become attractive so that the places where former African-American communities had been developed over in the 50s and 60s and even into the 70s are now being redeveloped in a way that creates potential to encounter traces of these former communities and for those traces to become heritage, to become assets in the struggle for justice, which has nothing to do with the regulatory pathways and authorities. Rather, it's recognized that suburban planning in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan region has not been a plan for justice at all. In 2016, the Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission adopted a sector plan, which is a binding planning document for the area of Bethesda containing Moses Cemetery. Soon after the sector plan was adopted, a private developer filed a preliminary plan to build a parking garage on the parcel containing the cemetery, exactly the kind of action that the sector plan was designed to enable. The opponents of this plan consisted of a group of environmental activists seeking to protect part of the Potomac River watershed and the Baptist church that rallied in support for the cemetery. Including receiving assistance and advice from Drs. Michael Blakey at William and May and Rachel Watkins at American University, who were both central figures in the investigations at the New York African Burial Ground, and which made it a watershed event for American archaeology. This group became known as the Bethesda African Cemetery Coalition under the leadership of Reverend Ogun Adebayo, who was pastor of the Macedonia Baptist Church, which, as I mentioned before, was established on River Road in Bethesda in the 1920s. Based on some successful collaborations with African American communities in DC, plus a little bit of word of mouth, the Macedonia Baptist Church, or that organization, directed the developer to hire us to investigate the cemetery and use non-destructive geophysical survey. So we prepared an assessment based on new and existing archival research gathered during the development of the sector plan. We concluded that the cemetery was built over, but substantially intact underneath the parking lot for the apartment building, which was completed in 1968, with no documented effort to move the cemetery during development of the land. The geophysical survey never materialized, and in part, it was because the community consented to no investigations whatsoever, and did not want any field work to take place until there were concessions by the county and the developer regarding the future disposition of the cemetery. So the advocates would not accept any outcome that did not entail pretty profound structural changes in the planning process, effectively confounding the development process through a strategy of intransigence. So protests were organized by the community and maintained pressure on the county in response. Advocates for the cemetery broke up public hearings, held sit-ins at the county offices, used the press, and eventually filed lawsuits. Even though the developer's preliminary plan was approved by the county planning board, the developer ended up transferring the property to Montgomery County's Housing Opportunities Commission, which is essentially a state-level organization for the purposes of housing development, low-income housing development in Montgomery County. So the advocates for the cemetery have seen a little bit of success, but do not really have what they want. And what they want has nothing to do with archaeology or any kind of investigation of the cemetery. They know their history, and archaeology doesn't clearly help them in the way that they need help. So the Montgomery County Housing Opportunities Commission sought to execute the sale, a $50 million profit, by the way, of this Westward Tower and associated parcels to a local investment firm. And the pending sale of the parcel contained the cemetery, at least as far as we know. So the Bethesda African Cemetery Coalition filed a lawsuit regarding the legality of the sale of a parcel that includes a cemetery, which was, for some reasons, scrubbed from all the county plat maps sometime in the early 1970s. I had the opportunity to testify as expert witness, and on October 25th, 2021, the Montgomery County Circuit Court ordered a halt of the sale of the parcel containing the cemetery. Deciding the case, Judge Carla wrote that there is a public interest in preserving the property, recognizing that the contract did not require the new developer to abide by this, and noting that it was critical to have input from the community members that were directly impacted. Recently, however, in June of 2023, an appellate court of Maryland granted an appeal filed by the HOC that nullified the ruling of the county circuit court. The successful appeal was founded on an argument that the land was not being sold for another purpose, in the sense that the land had been developed with an apartment tower and parking lot for the past 55 years, and it would continue to be used and serve this purpose after the sale. So against all evidence to the contrary, the commission claimed that the cemetery had been completely destroyed during construction of the apartment tower on the site in the 1960s, and that the use of the land for burial purposes had ended at that time. The HOC also attacked the standing of the Cemetery Coalition over the definition of persons of interest in the Maryland Code being, quote, persons who are related by blood or marriage to the person interred in a burial site, and persons who have a, quote, cultural affiliation with the person interred in a burial site, as presented in the appellate court decision. The commission charged that no individuals in the cemetery could prove descent, nor could they document purchase of a burial plot in a cemetery during its historical period of occupation. The commission also argued that because there is oral history evidence that some human remains were illegally removed from the site during construction in the 1960s, that no person could prove that their ancestor was still interred at Moses Cemetery today. Let that last claim sink in. The appellate court decided that a small number among the cemetery coalition did have standing as descendants from individuals buried at Moses Cemetery, but that the Housing Opportunities Commission did not require court approval to sell the land containing the cemetery, suggesting that this would apply only to the initial sale of the cemetery at the time of its closure to new interments. Yet the property will remain subject to the claims of the lot holders per the appellate court's decision. This reversal of the circuit court injunction moves the case to the Supreme Court of Maryland, which heard the case in the first week of January, and a decision is expected to come down at some time in May. So Maryland law empowers the court to enter a judgment that passes the ground to the buyer free of the owner's claims through title to the land or ownership of burial lots, which, because that information was erased, does not exist. But the clean title is clouded by a variety of willfully circular arguments, asking, where are the headstones? Knowing full well that the cemetery existed in a desecrated state, as the appellate court puts in a footnote to their decision, and was knowingly buried and paved over in the first place. Why are the descendants only speaking up now, as though the voice to speak had not been hard won through decades of struggle since the cemetery was desecrated? Or prove that the ancestors have not already been moved, prove a negative, and without doubly desecrating the site. And second, the court will review whether a court of equity needs to assess whether, and if so, on what conditions, a property owner can sell land containing a burial ground for non-burial use under Maryland law. And this comes from a view of an 1829 decision of the United States Supreme Court in Beatty versus Kurtz, which, applying Maryland law, charged courts of chancery operating pursuant to their equity powers to, quote, preserve the repose of the ashes of the dead and the religious sensibilities of the living, unquote. The fact that legal cases involving historic preservation occasionally raise procedural questions related to decision-making process or issues of substance regarding historic properties is not new. But what the Moses Cemetery case highlights is that the legal issues of jurisdiction, standing, laches, ripeness, mootness, and the scope of judicial review in cases involving descendant communities are also reliant on legal precedent that also fundamentally contributed to the disenfranchisement of these communities that have historically been harmed by the actions of local agencies and courts with additional harm. This includes, perhaps most importantly, the issue of standing, which is a required element to maintain a suit in any court. In fact, early opinions in historic preservation case law dismissed actions to enforce historic preservation regulations for lack of standing on grounds that plaintiffs had shown no real interest. But when standing is a legal setting also required. It's also required to show that injury has occurred. When a court accepts jurisdiction of a controversy, it generally limits the scope of its review to the administrative record in existence. This brings the importance of the administrative record into focus. In this instance, the positive assessment of the likely condition of the cemetery that we produced and the probability for intact burials and commingled remains from burials disturbed during previous construction and grading was only acted upon once the document was made public as part of the administrative record in the context of the original lawsuit filed against the Housing Opportunities Commission. So how do planning commissions justify their authority to regulate development? Case law precedent. Any more authority is challenged as overreach. So there's a real possibility that standing in the local planning arena is denied to descendant communities, and that this becomes a prohibitive element to eventual legal recourses, often which is the last recourse and check on planning authority. And as I noted, there are the issues that are challenged in the legal actions initiated by the Cemetery Coalition, but importantly, the issue of what we accomplish in partnership with local governments, archaeological professionals, and descendant communities in consultation or collaboration can be completely undermined by the challenge to these now long-established manners of engaging descendant communities when legal actions supplant community engagement in form and substance. And the result is a continuing harm to these historically marginalized communities. The case was litigated before the Maryland Supreme Court in January, and a decision is expected to come sometime in May of this year. And it has far and wide implications for the way we practice and the way we work with descendant communities on many types of projects. So thank you for that. Let me pull this down. Stop sharing. And if there are any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Hey,
Thank you for
Beth,
that, Lyle.
I see you there.
That was thank you for that meticulous use of evidence and just like the methodical care with which you laid that all out. That was amazing. So how can our people get involved in something this process? What are some advocacy organizations or volunteer opportunities that you could point us towards?
There's really very few organizations that focus on this. There's the Cemetery for the Protection of Maryland, the Maryland Cemeteries, which is a small organization. It was I guess it's based in Rockville, but they've been advocating for small family cemeteries that are being lost to development, and particularly more recently African American cemeteries. Montgomery County has, as a result of the Moses Cemetery issue as being sort of a big disruptor within Montgomery County, has hired a person who is specific, Brian Crane, who works for the county specifically to document cemeteries, and is focused very heavily on sort of these lost African American cemeteries. And for any development application that comes before the county staff, they will require some kind of documentation for these types of sites. But there's a lot of research that's being conducted, and I think that even the county will make use of a lot of larger scale volunteer efforts to help document cemeteries.
Good. I wonder if other folks have questions. Here's in the chat. Let's see here. From Richard. So recap it for me. In the absence of any or little evidence of the real relationship between archaeological findings and the people claiming a relationship to the sites, what can really be done to get around this?
Well, it's a difficult question, and because cemetery sites, African American cemetery sites, are, there's so many issues involved in these sites. one of the things that we always stress on day one when we're working with dissenting communities is that we are not decision makers, right? We are technical consultants that can document the sites and provide information to all of the stakeholders so they can make informed decisions. And that's important because we do not want to come across as um, as decision makers, right? Or as the experts who are telling these, public groups, communities, what their history is or how they should react in response to threats to these resources. So, and I think the counties have become very, the counties in this region have become very sensitized to the issue of cemetery projects. Loudoun County, for example, now requires that for any development project, that there's a very specific cemetery records search and professional walkover of the entirety of the property, right? Other counties do similar kinds of things. Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission has taken on many initiatives to help document these types of sites well before they're subject to developmental pressure. But it's not always easy. And in particular with African American cemeteries, a lot of this the documentation is stymied by the fact that records don't exist. So it makes it awfully difficult.
Do you work closely with folks in other cities? I'm thinking specifically of other like majority places like Detroit comes to mind. Do you have a network nationwide that you work with?
Yeah, to a certain extent. I mean, the archaeologists are a very small community, and we have many organizations that are national in scope. So there's a fair amount of professional coordination on these types of projects, particularly the complicated ones. So we have a fairly good um, body of expertise and body of knowledge on how these situations, how to deal with many of the situations that arise in these types of projects. The, as I said, these can be very complicated. There are a few that are relatively easy. We completed a cemetery assessment for Montgomery County in Fairland at the Calverton Galloway Park, for example. And in that case, that was a family farm up until the 1940s. The farmhouse burned down, and that the family sort of moved into that African American community, in Fairland. And the land was ultimately sold to a sand and gravel operation, which mined the property for sand and gravel. And then following that, it was used for um, bulk waste. So washing machines, roofing materials, things like that to fill in the large pits from the gravel mining operation. And then it was covered over with soil and now became Calverton Galloway Park, which is county owned. But the descendant community was concerned that the original developers had promised that they would leave the family cemetery intact. And so in coordination with the county, did a fair amount of research into historical records, tracing, land use and whatnot on that property. And then we did a geophysical survey of the area that they thought might be the cemetery. And in fact, found that the cemetery was still intact and the surrounding area was completely blitzed by all of the, more recent land use activities. And I think the county is sort of planning at this point to do some oral history work with the descendant community too, because all of these stories become important, and these are things that are just not very well documented in and how they contribute to the county and how they contribute, how these communities operated and whatnot. So it's important stuff. It's stuff that while many of these people are still alive, it's very much, in public interest to sort of collect this information for preservation.
Kind of bringing it back full circle to the 90-year-old Mr. Smith from the barber shop that you were
Right.
able to interact with. I agree. Documenting this stuff is really the only weapon that we have at this point, and I'm happy that we were able to participate in this process. And now this talk will be archived and available to others to keep that interest going and promote the importance of documenting this stuff wherever we are able to. It's just about 8 o'clock, so I think it's probably about time to wrap this up. Are there any other questions or comments for a while? Last call. I really appreciate your time and again just the sheer copiousness of the evidence and your obvious like knowledge and passion for this and you've highlighted something that I think a lot of us don't spend enough time thinking about and I was not aware of many of these instances that you pointed to, so thank you for that. And thank you for your time. I appreciate you.
Sure. It's complicated and it's one
Yeah,
of
for
the
sure.
most, you know, um, the most gut-wrenching kind of work we end up doing because we're not really trained or very good or very used to working with living
And you're at the intersection of all of these documentary systems with the law and politics and everything. It's just you mentioned several times that your main role was to be an expert witness, and I can imagine that that's a little bit thankless, really. But
and that truly is it really highlights the fact that our legal system is not oriented towards justice. It's oriented towards um, rectifying facets of the law. And in the case of Moses Cemetery, the part that becomes really that really stands out is that the case law that the planning board has to rely on is case law from the 1950s or earlier, which created much of this harm in the first place,
hmm
right? And this is something that the
the
court,
law was designed to maintain this imbalance, and now here we are.
that's right, that's right.
I didn't mean to talk over you there. You can finish your
Nope,
thought,
that's
please. Couple of people in the chat saying thanks. I echo that. That was very, very helpful. Thank you.
yeah, my pleasure.
All right, take care, everyone. We'll see you next month. I appreciate you all.